I called up Sonny for his birthday because we were born 3 months apart. He said, David, I met you in 55. You were a big hick playing with Charles Mingus. We used to play together. We worked together at Vassar College. I remember he said, but I'm 3 months older than you. He said, respect your elders. And after we were done laughing, we thought about that. And when you speak to Sonny, all he does is talk about those who came before him and the great musicians he grew up listening to. When I was with Charles Mingus, Jackie McLean and I used to go to where he lived in the projects afterwards and sit up all night talking about everything, including the music. One time I said, Jackie, remember that time you went, and I'm a blah blah. He said, don't talk about that stuff, man. I said, what do you mean? He said, that's what's supposed to happen. That's sacred stuff. You don't talk about that. You just hope it'll happen when everybody's tuned in to a higher power. Well, you can't say that in a book or in a lecture because it sounds like a new age franchiser trying to merchandise spiritual stuff. And anybody from any culture, when they see a ripoff artist like that coming, hide the silverware, because they know somebody's coming not to get enlightened, but to rip them off. So you can't tell people about that stuff. You just have to be it. A wonderful alto player who could play, Sonny Stitt could play everything in all 12 keys. If you came in and started bragging and saying you were this and you played with that person and all that stuff, they say, okay, let's do Cherokee. Oh, I know that. Okay, we're going to do it in B major, not B flat. So everybody who played a B flat, there was trumpet, tenor saxophone, or a C instrument, especially a B flat wind instrument, they've been practicing in the B flat, and then suddenly you got all these chord changes. Uh-oh. And if the person would, and they played it at that tempo and tear it up, then he would come over to the person who might look crestfallen and say, look, he said, I know you're a bad cat. He said, but next time, leave your attitude at home.
Ooh.
And but in the same time, he was so gracious. If you saw you were honored to be there, thrilled to be there, they would say, and Dizzy, when I first met him, when I was 20 years old, he said, what do you want to play? I said, what? He's asking me. And then what key? I said, why is he asking me that of all things? And the reason was he wanted me to be comfortable. And then he could do his stuff and hope maybe I'd pick up a little bit. And all of those guys just about were that way. And that was part of an unspoken ethic that predominated the whole scene. One of the things, Ken, that they often leave out is the idea of singing. When I was at the Marlborough Music Festival, which was all classical chamber musicians, Rudolf Serkin and Pablo Casals and Marcel Moyes, the great flute player, they would say, you must sing. And then now you play it. Then I was with Dizzy Gillespie on his 70th birthday. He had this great big band of every fantastic musician you could think of. I was just lucky enough to be in it because he knew me for so long. And I said, Diz, there are about 300 French horn players that can play those parts. If I'm not improvising, better than I can. On the first time, I said, nah, I want you. So I was blessed by God and lucky, as everyone else was with him too, to be there with him. Lalo Schifrin had written these really incredible arrangements just for the concert. And Dizzy said, hey, he said, put down your horns. He said, it's not happening. He said, sing it. He said, what's written there? He said, now put down your horns and sing that and snap your fingers. Steve Teray said, I can't sing. He said, Steve, he said, you're a monster player. You can play anything. He said, I know you can sing it too. So we all got over our inferiority complex of being about rotten singers once. And then he said, now pick up your horns and play it. Sure enough, we could play it 5 times better just by trying to sing it. And I said, good Lord, here's the master of all the musics Dizzy has conquered and joined and shared with us. He's doing the same thing that Rudolf Serkin and the great classical cats from Europe who came over because of the war. They wouldn't have ever even bothered to come here except to tour. And they were living here. They were showing us the same principle. And sure enough, they it worked for both genres, for any genre. So if you go to Pakistan or Egypt or any place in the Middle East or Southeast Asia or a lot of other places, you learn by trying to sing it and listening to singers some of that inside stuff of the phrasing and the feeling. And then if you do it long enough, you can get to play with other people from that culture. And suddenly, boy, you feel you're in another world, but you're not in another world. You're in our world, which just like the sunsets or a beautiful rainstorm or something happening is just a magical, mysterious, one time only experience that you happen to be around and you can at least respect it. And
Mm.
when you approach music that way, that is not just hitting all the right notes or getting a great gig or copying someone else's job or being a star for a week. It's about actually being. And as far as we were saying, the person playing one tune, when I was when I was playing with Mingus and Sonny had come back from Chicago, and he was all just he would play, sit in with the Mingus a lot, and every time he played a solo, it was like a Beethoven concerto. It was just like phenomenal. So I heard this guy on the radio. I said, Sonny, I heard a tenor player, just same instrument you play. All he played was dap, 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 dap. He played one note for 4 minutes. What's up with that? Sonny said, and I never forgot it. He said, don't put that cat down. That's the best he can do.
That's the story. Yeah.
And that was the whole thing. And when you see that, instead of and then he was inferring, if you don't dig it, he's already done it. So he's got that covered. So do something else. So if you hear something you don't like, you could say, well, to the extent that that's what I sometimes do is a drag to have to listen to it. So maybe I'll figure a different way of doing it. And then you spend your whole life figuring what not to do by what you would like to do, even if you can't do it, because you're exposed to it. And when I was at Monk's house, we were listening to some country station, I remember, and the singer was, I know I put my cow, but wow, wow, the dog went bow, wow, and somehow I said, what in God's name is a New York AM station playing something? I was, and being brought up on our farm, I heard some badass country singers as well as ones that nobody ever heard of. And they were saying something, or they would have even gotten to make the record. And because the people that made those records knew about that, what they were recording, and could often sing and play themselves. They had some understanding of what they were doing. And I was listening to that, and I said, geez, Monk, you really like this kind of music? And he said, listen to the drummer. And he played about 4 more things. I said, good God, how could it? And then I listened, I could sort of hear vaguely, and he said, check out his brushwork. So he found the beauty part in that recording, and he just concentrated on that and blotted out all the other stuff. I said, wow, that's the way to try to live and the way to try to do music. And that way, you're always moving forward yourself.
Wow. What I mean, who would have ever thought Charlie Parker and Thelonious Monk would spend time listening to and appreciating popular country music, not even, the profound stuff, but just what, because yeah, it's a beautiful frame of mind.
Oh, they loved other music. It was Charlie Parker who told me to listen to Frederick Delius. And the little bit of music schooling I had, I was told the classic lines. He was a minor composer. And being from Pennsylvania, I never knew that he'd worked in the coal mines, so it didn't mean he was that kind of minor. They just meant he was second rate, as if they had some great accountant in the sky organizing who was what position, all of that stuff that's got nothing to do with anything except trying to um, categorize things that don't need any categorization. If it tastes good, it is good to eat. If it sounds good, it's good music. Case dismissed. So he said, listen to some of Delius's music. Listen to his sense of orchestral coloration. I said, wow. So I began to listen to Frederick Delius, not thinking he was a minor composer, but listening to what the heck he wrote with an open mind. And all of those guys, Dizzy and Bird and everyone, loved Bartok and Stravinsky. So we were brought up with a lot of, and Dizzy used to say to me, you know, I hope that he likes my last record. So I would ask Metropolis when I saw him, did you like Mr. Gillespie's latest recording? He said, yes. He said his harmonic sense is fabulous. And he'd go into a whole big discussion of in his playing. And then the greatest thing I can tell you, which I don't think has ever probably been in public before, when I was a composer in residence with a Philharmonic, and I really got to know Bernstein well, and so I was interested in music and grateful to be with him rather than just being pathologically jealous and looking for more gigs. Uh, he said, you know, he said, I adored Dizzy's music. And my first job when I got out of Harvard, before I got into Curtis, I worked for a Tin Pan Alley monster. I can't remember his name. And my job was to transcribe jazz solos. So I transcribed a whole solo that Dizzy played or something. Years later, I said, Mr. Gillespie, I'd love you to look at this trumpet solo. He looked at it and Dizzy said, man, Camp, are you kidding? You nobody could play this stuff. He said, no, Dizzy said, that's what you played. He said, oh, and Diz
Wow.
could write everything down. One
Wow.
time he told me doing Night in Tunisia and they lost all the charts, as they used to call them. He said, you got a pencil? The guy said, yeah, he was in the phone booth. He said, let me sing you. Boop, 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 boop. You know, began to sing all the different parts. And he did Manteca and some of the other ones. And he sang all the basic parts over the phone. He said, just give each person their part and I'll get there and they'll know what to do. He sang the whole arrangement over the telephones. And I remember what Monk said. He pointed out the window where he lived in the 60s, West 60s. And he said, someday over there, pointing out the window, meaning the whole world, there's people not just going to take our records and listen to them and copy them. They're going to make their own jazz. And he said, quote, that's the idea.
Oh,
I said,
beautiful.
wow, he foresaw all that. I mean, you go to Europe now, they don't need to import a bass player or a drummer to get that groove happening. They've got people over there that can
Yeah.
play their hands off. And Dizzy's, when we were on the way to Cuba the first time, years before I met you in 1967, we were the, or seven, I beg your pardon,
I think
77, we were
76.
the first.
It was that Carter, 76. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks to Carter, it was Dizzy Gillespie, Earl Hines, Stan Getz, and it was supposed to be Lionel Hampton, but he canceled out. So uh, they said, who are we going to get? It was 40. They said, well, someone in the office told me, you get Dave Amram, he could speak some Spanish, he could play with anybody. And the third thing, which I don't advertise, and he's the least expensive. So,
You have a great, hey, you know what? You have a great story about because it's you went there by boat.
yeah.
Did you leave out of New Orleans or did you leave out of Miami or something? Do you remember the boat?
No, we got on the boat in New Orleans, and Fidel Castro's sister was there picketing us, which I said, oh, because I just wanted to go down, and all the musicians, we were all struggling capitalists. It wasn't the
And
Venceremos
and there
Brigade.
was a funny I remember you told me there was a sort of a funny social scene on the boat because it was a cruise and everybody else on the cruise were cruisers. They
Yeah,
weren't jazz cats,
that's
and I
putting it
think
mildly.
Dizzy had there were a lot of them for Texas because they're the ones with the
Yeah,
money
he had
down
his
there.
Harvard sweatshirt, Harvard T-shirt on. We went to this dinner where everybody was all dressed up to meet the captain, and everybody, and there was Dizzy with his shirt, laughing and telling jokes, and we were all the musicians were there screaming with laughter and chopping up a storm. Suddenly, I was sitting next to a very well-dressed woman, and her husband was there, looking real sour because they were Lawrence Welk fans basically, and they had a jazz cruise and hadn't sold any tickets. When they said they could go to Cuba, they said, well, instead of going to Kenya and getting photographed with a giraffe, we'll go to Cuba and get photographed with a commie. So we were just extra, and they were wondering what the heck we were even doing at the dinner party. So the woman next to the man, they would serve some salad. So instead of taking his salad fork, he took the fork, the big fork, and she went, slapped him, said, use the salad fork. He said, all right, dear. So he changed forks. And Dizzy, with his mouth full of food, saw his moment to lighten things up. And he said, ha, 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 with all the food hanging out of his mouth. My wife does the same thing, man. If I read where she get on my case, ha, 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 and put his arm around him. The whole table started screaming with laughter.
Oh,
The whole scene changed. After it was all over, everybody started talking to each other and being nice. I said, Dizzy, you turned that whole thing around. How did you do that? It was so wonderful. He said, man, he said, that's, you got to do that in life. He said, that scene was so oppressive, I couldn't digest my food. So he said, I learned to create my own environment. And then what is happening, sit back and just be part of it. I said, wow.
let's just go down the line. Monk. I remember you telling me Monk was explaining to you about the keyboard that, hey, it's all visual, right? Just what did he
No,
say?
Monk
What
said,
exactly
oh,
did
he
he say
said,
to you?
we were playing up. He was at Nika's and he was doing one of the, and I thought they were all asleep. I wouldn't have dared play that, her beautiful piano if I knew Monk was awake, or she was, because she knew a lot about music too. And I can't remember who else was crashed. It was one of those 48-hour parties and everybody crashed out. I said, man, I got to get some music written. I was writing music for Shakespeare in the Park. And and the monk came out in his pajamas. I said, hey. And he said, you sound all right. I said, oh, God, monk. I said, if I'd known you were awake, I wouldn't have even dared play. He said, no, no, man. He said, stick with the piano, even if you're a French horn player. He said, because he said, with the piano, you can not only hear it, you can see it. Bam! I'd never been told that. I was only told in school, if you're little schooling I had, if you use the piano, you're cheating because Mozart could just sit down at the desk and write everything out. Then I found out, of course, from Charles Mills, one of my great teachers, told me how and he could sit down at a desk and write a whole symphony out with a pen and ink, write the
Hmm.
score out right from his head. He said, everybody can't do that. He said, it doesn't make any difference. Brahms used the piano all the time. And then he went down the whole list. Composers told me to read Stravinsky's book. And Stravinsky talks about how he would play 14 different versions of one big chord till he got the right one. He says,
Wow.
indicating someone has to mind the score. And Monk was the one that said, no, I said, use the piano. He said, you can see it. And I never realized it was a visual instrument, and therefore you could mess around and say, from this to that, I better write that down because I can never remember it.
Right.
And when I showed Bill Evans my piano sonata, he said, man, you wrote all that stuff down. I said, yeah. I said, Bill, you could write the best piano sonata that anybody ever did in American history. He said, nah, I never bothered to. I said, really? How come? He said, because anything I hear, I can play. I didn't realize that he spent a lot of time writing stuff down too, but it was true. He just had that phenomenal ability. And I said, well, that's one reason I became a composer, because a lot of stuff I can hear, I can't play until I've figured it out.
Gotcha. And that was a lesson from Bill Evans. Um,
Sure.
how about Charlie Parker? You told me a story once long ago about making. You have a special signature dish, which is basically whatever is in the kitchen goes in the pot, and it's kept you with vigor all these years. And you mentioned hanging out with Bird one night. I don't know how much time you actually got to spend with him in cumulatively, but what was he like?
Well, he was he was like an encyclopedia of knowledge of just about everything and anything. It was like when I was with Leonard Bernstein after I got to really know him. They start talking about something, and boy, he had a whole encyclopedic knowledge of just about every situation, every culture, and was so brilliant and so warm. And then I thought, well, nostalgia can sugarcoat your memory. Then, God, it must be 50 years later, I heard that wonderful interview he did when Paul Desmond was a very young guy, and interviewing him, which suddenly, magically, thank God, appeared from someone's trash can onto the onto a shellac homemade seed, record, and then finally got on the air. And there I heard his voice. That was exactly what I remember him sounding like, so articulate and so warm, and especially anything to do with music, always telling people how they should stay with their instrument, that your horn could be your best friend, and to respect other
Wow.
people and love what you were doing. And and at the same time, he didn't, if somebody was really a drag, he could get rid of them immediately by saying something, a very gruff tone, like a king or an emperor, and scare the crap out of them. They go away
He
and not.
he he had a beautiful resonant voice and a beautiful, that Midwestern
Yeah,
neutral English, seemingly without accent, right? And of course, other people would hear an accent in it, but he just had a beautiful speaking voice and a
oh,
very
did he?
dignified in that interview, very dignified without being haughty or stuffy,
Yeah.
just natural dignity. Um, uh, did you ever cross paths with Bud Powell?
Well, when I was at Birdland and Gigi Grace was there, we were playing with Oscar Pettifer's band, and we were off that night, so we all came down just to hear everybody. And Bud was there, and he wasn't playing. So Gigi said, "Hey, go talk to Bud, man. He's not talking to anybody. People are scared of him or think he's crazy." But he said, just mostly you'll be able to read his mind. I said, whoa. I knew, I knew. So when I first met Miles, I never said anything. I was at the Cafe Bohemia, and when we were off, our whole band would come down. I was there with Cecil Taylor and Allen Ginsberg, of all people, and Gregory Corso, the poet. We were sitting there, and Miles would play this fantastic. As after he came back from Newport, and everybody thought he was all washed up, and he was such a hit. And he made a record, and he started to. It was during his comeback in the fall of '55, and he would walk by the bar, and we'd be sitting there at the bar, and everybody would slap five before that became a football. Uh,
Oh, okay.
so we give a voluntary slap, you give you some skin, blap. After about the fifth night, giving me some skin, he went slap, and then he went with his hand, meaning follow me, I thought. So I followed him out. He walked out the door on the street, at Barrow Street it was called, turned to the left, and we walked about 5 minutes to Washington Square Park without saying a word, just ESP, you might call it, communication. Finally, he said, "Where are we going?" I said, "I don't know, Miles. I'm just following you." He cracked up laughing and didn't say a word. But after that, we became friendly until he passed away. And it was sort of, Bud was the same way, but he wouldn't even say anything. You could just feel that ESP thing that you have when you're playing with people and you suddenly, something is going to happen, and it does, and you're ready for it or whatever. In indefinable, indescribable. he was on that level all the time, as if you were playing music with him. So
Oh,
once in a while
wow.
I'd say something, but mostly he was just very, very quiet uh, until his brother died, and then we went to his house with all the different people.
That's Richie Powell.
Yeah, when Richie died in that car accident with Clifford and everybody, and they were all sitting there. And Bud said, "Too fast. Cats drive too fast." That was the first time I ever heard him. He was a very, really, you could see a super sensitive person. And by that time, I think he'd kind of given up on most people. He had the they treated him,
The
supposedly
shock
treated him
treatments. Yeah.
well, and that messes up everybody. But I think when you hear, when you hear him play, uh, all these years later, you hear some of those tapes he made in Paris, especially. He could still play up a terrifying
We,
storm.
what was so interesting, and thank God someone filmed that. Um, he there was no separation between him and his instrument. It was like
Oh,
breathing. It was as easy
yeah.
as breathing for him. And he was in a reverie. It was so in him. He wasn't playing. He was there and things were
Yeah.
happening. I guess is the way I would just, you know what I mean? It's like, it's
Oh,
usually
sure.
very, okay, here's me, here's my instrument, I'm doing something. With him, he was just sort of this guy sitting there and it was just all flowing out of him through his hands. And, he's just, it's extraordinary. Ornette said to me, I was talking with him about another great pianist, and he said, "Oh, but Bud Powell." And Annette, I never heard Annette say that about anybody, actually. He said, "Oh no, but Bud was that times 10."
Yeah. Well, I think he got to the point, I think, where he figured that's the only thing he could trust. And that was the
Mm,
only thing he had left.
mm,
That the rest of it had been such a disappointment that he just kind of bailed out.
yeah, yeah. And then how about if I may, one more, and then I think we'll say goodbye. Mingus, you worked with Mingus.
Yeah. That
What
was my
was
first
now he
job in
was
New York.
a rough character. If I that's at least that's how he's portrayed.
Well, he was playing with Bud Powell, in fact, and the Bud Powell trio, and Leonard Feather invited me because he'd written up I was an American soldier, and this is 1955, and so he invited me to come with him. I said, sure. I'd never heard Bud Powell live at that point. This was 1955. He was at Birdland, and I saw the bass player was standing in front of Bud Powell, leading the trio. I said, "Wow, that's pretty weird," but he played great. And I heard Charles Mingus's name, so Mingus came. I don't know. Bud just kind of went in the back room like he always would, disappeared.
Yeah.
And Mingus saw Leonard, and Leonard was one of the first guys back then, at that time, who really appreciated Bird and Dizzy and everybody before the other jazz critics did. So Mingus went up and said hi, and he was standing up, and Leonard Feather said, "Here's Dave Amram. He just came to town, and he's a real good jazz French horn player." And Mingus looked at me with that terrifying glare and said, "Would you go on the road with me for $125 a week?" I think if I said yes, he probably would have punched me in the mouth. But I said, "I'd love to, Mr. Mingus, but I'm going to Manhattan School of Music on the GI Bill, and Gunther Schuller is going to be my French horn teacher, helped me to get back, encouraged me to come back here. And I'm enrolling next week." He said, "You'll learn more from me than you ever will in school." So he said, "See if you can do both." And I said, "Well, I'm not in the union. I just got here. I have to wait. I'm in the Washington, D.C. local, which I was in before I went in the army." But he said, "No," he said, I'll make a case." That's what he said. And he went down there, and I guess terrified everybody into playing. The other French horn player was Julius Watkins, who was fantastic, but he was already playing a bunch of gigs for a month, and Junior Collins, who was fabulous, but he was in jail. So they said, "Well, you're in the union. Can you get anybody else that knows how to do that? And they said, no, there's nobody. This was 55. Now there's a whole bunch of jazz
Sure,
French horns. That
sure.
time there wasn't any of us except for us three basically out there doing that, improvising. And so he said, well, you come up with George Barrow, come to my house and we'll see how you're doing. So I was playing with him. He said, hey, it's all right. He said, go to be at the Cafe Bohemia next week. So we started playing. That was like my third week in New York. I was scared to death. I mean, it was all these heavy Jack. That's before Jackie, but George Barrow was playing. Wonderful bunch of bass players. Mostly Mingus would play. Then he'd have other bass players come. Then he had three different drummers that he would fire and rehire each night. So all three of them sat there. And Ron Jefferson Jr., he was a conversationalist, sort of like Bud. He would say, "Who's that swing, baby?" That was the extent. He could say a lot more, but that was all he would ever say to anybody. Ron Jefferson, "Who's that swing?" That was his commentary on everything. And then when he'd get fired, he said, "I'll be back," because he'd always be rehired before the night was over. So about the second week, I was playing, and I felt so good, God, I said, Jesus, it was like heaven. And I started to play the third chorus. Bam! I felt this elbow in my ribs going bam.
Whoa.
And then, no more than two choruses with me, motherfucker. I said, oh. And then because I was only 24 still, just about to turn 25. So I drank a few beers and I said, Mingus, we got to go outside. He said, what do you mean? I said, I can't be treated like a dog. I said, we're going to have to fight. He said, what? And I said, well, he said, I can kill you. I said, well, maybe so. I said, but I know I can hit you at least once before you knock me down. I used to be a gym teacher. So I went outside and he looked at me and said, you seriously want it? I said, yeah, man. He said, he put his arm around me. He said, let me buy you a drink. So he took me back into the Cafe Bohemia bar with Jimmy Garofalo, who was the manager and thrower outer. If he didn't like the customer's attitude, he'd go beat them up. He was a pretty rough cat. And Mingus said, this cat, he wanted to fight with me. He said, buy him a drink. And after that, he was really, really friendly. And I think if watching him, if I'd been gracious to him or said, I really like your music, or it's so nice to be with you and thank you, he probably would have punched me out. He couldn't stand obsequiousness. He couldn't stand people sucking up to him. And I guess because he'd been hurt so often, that really got to him. So people would come up and say, Mr. Mingus, you're really a fabulous music. Bow! He'd hit them or he'd get angry at them. And if they just acted like they didn't give a crap, he was comfortable.
Gotcha.
And we stayed friends.
What an amazing story. That's a whole new dimension of you, David. I wasn't aware of street brawler, potential street brawler.